All in.
All in.
Wow,
All you can do.
Antonio jams.
This is Antonio Esfandiari. He is a magician, and his most famous trick is to make your chips go away at the poker table. He recently appeared in one of the most recent live streams on Hustler Casino Live and ran over the new generation of poker players and won $300,000 in under 6 hours. Many claim that the old generation poker players are irrelevant and outdated because of the rise of solvers and GTO and strategy builders, but Antonio might change that thought pretty quickly. First hand, he looks at pocket kings on the button. Antonio 3-bets Tomer, who's holding ace-7 of hearts from the hijack, and Tomer calls. We go to the flop of queen jack 3, 2 hearts. Our magician continues for a very standard 1/3 pot bet, and Tomer calls. After Tomer just calls, Mr. Magician knows that he's highly likely to hold middle pair, weak top pair, or a nutted flush draw, as he would raise hands like queen jack, lower flush draws, or open-ended straight draws. Sets are out of the question, except pocket threes maybe, as Tomer would almost 4-bet with jacks and queens at full frequency, considering how light HCL plays.
13K in there.
When Tomer checks on the 5 of spades on the turn, Antonio knows that his opponent is extremely capped and inelastic, meaning that he has a hand that would take a similar action against any bet size that's not too big. Knowing that he's very likely ahead, Antonio sizes up to 11,000. An 87% pot bet, which is perfect for targeting hands like exactly what Tomer's holding, and a hand that's like ace-jack or ace-queen with some sort of heart or ace-spade. Tomer very hesitantly makes the call, and the magician's magic begins.
Come on, let me get
Fold
my
to a
first
big
button.
bet.
He's a non-believer. Sometimes they don't believe.
You can see him observing his opponent after he calls him a non-believer to get a read on the spot. We can see the discomfort in Tomer's face and posture after hearing these magical words. After Tomer checks one last time on the river, Antonio recognizes that he has Tomer always beat here. It's really hard to get all the money in if the opponent has a hand like a jack or weak queen, but Antonio has a spell for everything. He quickly grabs the first pile of chips he can find and announces all in. This is usually a tell within the poker community where if someone's quickly trying to shovel money into a pot without too much thought, they must be bluffing. I'm sure Antonio is aware of it because he would usually target hands like top pair or worse with a smaller bet in the spot, but he goes for max value and he knows that the only way he's getting called if he looks like some sort of like a weird line bluff. His speech play on the turn sets us up perfectly, and the pace and the fashion he puts all the chips on the river completes the entire picture and sets up for Tomer. Tomer must be under this very strong spell because he puts in the call without too much thought, only to realize he was extremely dominated all the way and milked. This hand is really important because a lot of players have really hard time understanding what their opponent's ranges are, and he's usually scared to size up when they need to. Next hand, Antonio raises with the king-queen of clubs from the button. Cannon 3-bets with ace-jack offsuit to 6,000, as the button open raising range will be fairly wide. Antonio calls. We go to a flop of ace-7-6 all clubs. Antonio flops the nuts. Cannon checks, and Antonio is aware that his opponent can have a lot of strong ace-x in his hand, like ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack after he 3-bets flop. If Cannon completely misses, Antonio won't be able to get any value from him regardless. This is why he sizes up and picks about a 75% pot size and bets 8,000. He's targeting the holdings that have a strong ace or even lower aces, which could potentially be 2 pair now. Needless to say, Cannon calls after some thought. The turn is the 4 of spades, which is effectively a brick, and Kenneth checks again. Antonio is not going to slow down here, and he's going to size up to 18,000 with again a 75% pot bet. This bet is again targeting holdings we mentioned, and after facing this much aggression, Kenneth decides that he's had enough of these shenanigans and that he decides to turn his pair of aces into a bluff, as he would play all of his smaller made flushes, a similar way of check calling the flop and getting aggressive on the turn, trying to get all the money into the middle. So Kenneth check raises to 36,000, and this is music to Antonio's ears. I love this from Antonio where he starts fake tanking and asks Kennen how much total he has. He does some fake inventory counting and puts in the call. The river bricks when the queen of diamond rolls over. Now you can see the frustration in Kenneth's eyes as he's aware that he's probably beat after Antonio calls the turn raise. He gives up and checks. Antonio goes all in as he has the nuts and Kennen calls, thinking Antonio can have some bluffs at this spot, and he's probably too pot committed in his head. This spot is more of Kennan's fault, as the stack to pot ratio on the turn was not enough for him to go for a check raise. He either could have given up earlier or just called to see what Antonio is going to do on the river without the raise, and another 74,600 gets pushed Mr. Magician's way. After these first two pots and 2 hours into the stream, Mr. Magician is up about 150,000. We can see that he has the lowest VPIP at 31%, which from a strategy perspective is superior when everyone else on the table is playing like maniacs with VPIPs above 50%. Being tighter in a splashy environment will benefit players with smaller VPIPs if they know what they're doing. As Antonio raises to 500 with Queen 10 of Hearts, the next hand, Ryan Feldman calls and Dylan now re-raises from the cutoff to 2400. Antonio calls, and Ryan comes along the way as well. 3 ways into the flop of Ace Jack 6, 2 diamonds. It checks all the way to the Dylan, who bets 3300. Antonio called with the backdoor hearts in a gutter, and Ryan gets out of the way with the best of it. In the turn, now comes the King of Hearts, the absolute best card in the deck for Antonio, as now he has the nuts with a redraw to the Queen High Flush. Dylan also makes 2 pair with this card as well. Antonio checks and Dylan sizes up to 10,000. Antonio gives it some thought and decides he wants to play for all of it by the river and puts in a check raise to 29,000. Dylan obviously doesn't like this spot because there's not too many bluffs here, but he's ahead of a lot of flush draws, and Antonio could be doing this with something just like ace that has a heart in it. Keep in mind that if Antonio just had a pair of aces, he can easily call this turn bet and go to the river, so him raising here polarizes his hand to represent a draw or the absolute nuts, which in this case he has both. The river rolls out the Queen of Diamonds, probably the worst card in the deck because front door flush gets there. Antonio no longer has the nuts and Dylan was calling to dodge a card exactly like the Queen of Diamonds. Antonio is aware of the situation and now takes the betting lead to go for a small size of 44,000. This is to get a crying call from a holding that's like Ace-X that would check back this river a lot of the time. Dylan thinks a lot and verbalizes that he can't beat many hands. He tanks. After more thought, he puts on the call and hears the bad news from Mr. Esfandiari, and Esfandiari wins another 81,000 and gets added to his stack, counting to get max value with his good hands in the session. The following hand, Antonio opens Ace-Jack from under the gun position to $500. Peter, who wakes up with queens now, 3 bets to 5,000. Only Antonio and Kenan calls, and we go to a flop of Jack 4 deuce with 2 hearts. Antonio has top and Kenan has second pair. Everyone seems to have a piece of the pie, and action checks to the Peter. Peter bets 15,000. Obviously with top pair, Antonio quickly puts on the call and Kenan gets out of the way. The turn is now the Queen of Spades, giving Peter a set. Antonio demotes the second pair, and Antonio checks. Peter bets 25,000 on this card. Antonio is going to have a lot of flush draws, hands like the one he exactly has in the situation, and Antonio could also have a hand like 10s, 8s, 9s, which gives Peter a chance to load more money onto the pot by betting half pot size. In a very standard fashion, Antonio calls it 25,000. Off to the river, which is going to come the King of Diamonds. This card's probably the worst card in the deck for Antonio because now all the flush draws miss and Peter's bluffs, including a king now, beats him. Peter could easily arrive and play ace king, king 9, or king queen this way, and Antonio has a lot of missed flushes which would not arrive here too often. Given how tight Antonio is, both players are aware that Antonio is going to be massively under bluffing in the spot. Antonio checks and Peter goes for a bet of 65,000. Antonio starts thinking, but the king coming on the river, now he's losing to all the bluffs, as well as strictly now a flush draw. Peter is a loose player, but this line on this board is really hard to blast off as a bluff. However, Mr. Magician can't find the correct reasoning to fold his pair of jacks, and he calls. I really don't like this call from him, because on this board you'd expect Peter to have the nuts or air as he's very polarized, and now the bluffs could have some value in the end. Remembering that Peter 3-bet pre, he's going to have at least some showdown value on this very high board, which would likely check back the river with, so I don't like this call at all. Our next hand, Kenan raises to 5,000 with pocket 5s under the gun, folds all the way to Antonio, who calls. We go to the flop, which comes Jack 8 Ace Rainbow. Antonio has 2 pair, and I think he believes he has this board locked up most of the time, which is why he checks to the aggressor, who's going to have a lot of Ace King, Ace Queen, which he can potentially be ahead of. Kenan bets 3,000, which is very standard, and Antonio calls. The turn is now the 5 of hearts, giving Kennen the most disguised set of all time. This is a disaster situation, as this card would mostly favor Antonio. Antonio checks once more and Kennen bets 12,000. Antonio, without seeing Kennen's cards, is loving life at the moment. He goes for a check raise to 39,000 for max value, targeting a higher ace that he's beating, or a draw like Jack 10 or Queen Jack of Hearts. Kennen now 3 bets to 66,000 and Antonio snap jams on top of him, followed by a call from Kennen. How did the action escalate so fast, and how do we somehow end up in a $324,000 pot? They run it twice, no ace or no eights on either of the boards, giving Kennen to win for a stack out on both boards. Antonio gets stacked with $150,000 in his stack, and he needs to find a way to come back off after losing this massive one, but it is a massive cooler that I have to add that in there as well. Brittany raises 6 use of clubs from the cutoff to 2,000. Mike X in the small blind now comes in as well with the ace set of diamonds, and Antonio per standard 3 bets his king queen off to 10,000. Peter overcalls from under the gun straddle, and Mike X completes as well. 3-way onto the flop, which is 7-4-2, 2 diamonds. Mike X takes the betting lead and bets for 50,000 as his hand starts liking to load more money into the pot with a low board and 2 diamonds out there. Antonio now raises to 50,000, getting super out of line, but he's going to have a lot of overpairs on this board after 3-betting pre-flop, and he can get a lot of equity folded out. Just not exactly the ace 10 of diamonds here, as we hear Mike X taking no time before going all in to realize his equity. Antonio has to call, given how much he's already committed into the pot, which is only 30,000 more. They decide to run this one twice, and it's a $200,000 pot. First run out, Mike X hits a 10, and the second run out is 2 blanks, and Mike X and Antonio are going to chuck this $200,000. The stream pulls up a chart, and we can see how balanced Antonio is, as all these players have different play styles, and Antonio looks to be very balanced and deviating against the general public. This is one thing about having so much experience at the poker table, as his brain is wired to make auto adjustments to different play styles he's going to face. Before we going into the next pot, quick reminder that 98% of my viewers are not subscribed, so if you're enjoying this content, I would love it if you click that red button and support me. Enough with the shameless plug. Let's go into this hand where Magician starts casting spells all over the table and raises with 6-8 offsuit. Kennen comes in for a 3-bet to 3,500 with King 10 of spades. Peter calls King Queen off, and Antonio now 4 bets to 20,000, and both players call. It comes 6-9-3 rainbow. Antonio leads for 28,000 with his 1 pair holding. Kennen gets out of the way, and now Peter check raises to 60,000. I can't believe my eyes. Both players have way overrepresented their hand strengths at this point. Both of them can have all the overpairs, but Peter's going to be more capped since he would likely 5-bet all of his hands that are super strong, like 10s or better, but he didn't on pre-flop. Antonio knows this, but he tanks about 2 minutes, considers all the options facing this raise, and he goes all in for a 4-bet with just a pair of 6s. What a madman. This decision mostly comes out of the fact that Peter can't really call unless he has a hand that's jacks or better. I mean, maybe not even jacks, because of how uncapped Antonio looks in this situation. With no flush draws available, it's also really hard for Peter to call a hand like Ace King or Ace Queen as well. This play looks like madness, but shows how good and how smart Mr. Magician is, understanding his opponent's tendencies and deviating to the target aggressive player by being overly aggressive in spots where he can have all the aces, kings, and queens. When there's no equity, Peter's calling range is very narrow in this 4-bet pot. Amazing play from Mr. Magician as Peter folds his cards. This is a great read and peak poker, because I never see myself or a recreational player taking this line. Antonio wins a couple small ones in a standard fashion, and the end of the night winnings are displayed on the screen as he racks up $300,000 in profit for the night. The old generation pros are better than the new generation players? I don't know. Maybe. Let me know in the comments below, and happy holidays. Peace.